Hello and welcome. You are listening to the Investor Lab, the auditory epicenter for passionate people seeking a life of freedom, choice, and abundance. And on today's show, I talked to Sean Simpson, who is the Senior Analyst at Dashdot, and we talked about why you shouldn't invest in the latest hotspot. Ooh, a little bit contrarian. We talked about some examples about people getting into hotspots too late when they hear about it in the news, how to pick markets a little bit early, the value of being a contrarian investor and getting into markets a little sooner. We talked about some case studies of clients who have actually smashed it and gotten more growth in like 12 to 14 months than the previous owners got in the previous 12 to 14 years. Really, really interesting stuff there. Where you can go right, where you can go wrong, and how you need to think a little bit differently in order to be a successful investor, why you shouldn't follow the media. So if that sounds good to you, then this is going to be a great episode for you. And I encourage you to like, rate, review, share this with a friend, family member, or loved one. And without any further ado, let's get stuck right into it. I'll see you on the inside. Hey guys, welcome back to the Investor Lab. Joining me on today's show is Sean Simpson. Sean's been on the show before. He is the Senior Property Analyst at Dashdot. He's the guy that is like looking at all the locations, signing off on everything, making sure all the data makes sense, making sure we're making good property investment decisions. Sean, how are you today?
I'm really well, thank you. How are you?
Very well. Now, you've actually recently relocated to another part. Have you relocated yet? Is that what's happening?
No, I'm 4 or 5 days away. Next Friday, I'm
4 or 5 days away.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, a lot happening.
So last time you were on the show, I believe we were talking about the fact that you had been doing a bit of renovation and all of that kind of stuff. So that project's coming to an end?
Not quite. It's actually, I'm halfway through a strata subdivision, and one side's on Airbnb, and we're trying just about every property strategy under the sun, but yeah, it's not quite finished. Nearly.
So you're halfway through and you're just like, bugger this. I'm gonna move.
Yep,
I'm gonna move to the tropics.
No, there's only one kitchen, one bathroom, and the subdivision bit's all pretty well done. So yeah, the less complicated stuff to go. So
nice.
That's all good.
Nice, good stuff. Well, as much as I would love to dig into your property adventures, what I want to talk about today is why you shouldn't invest in the latest hotspot, which is a little bit contrarian, I think, because everyone thinks, oh, you should invest in the latest hotspot. Shouldn't you invest in hotspots? That seems like a pretty good idea. What we want to talk about today is we want to talk about Bundaberg specifically, which is a really interesting example of a location which was recently, as we recently saw in the 7 News. 7 News came out with a big article, Bundaberg, the latest investment hotspot and all of this kind of stuff, right around the same time that we actually decided to stop buying there, which is pretty interesting. What do you think about that, Sean?
Yeah, I think it is very, very interesting, but I think it's another really good example of once these big media companies dive on these areas, you're probably a good bit too late. You might be 6, 12, 18 months too late, which is why you really need to be ahead of the game in any way that you can in identifying these areas before the general public obviously gets this big flagged headline and goes nuts on the area.
I think it's a really interesting case in point around how the most successful investors inherently must be contrarian thinkers, right? And there's a quote that I've used on the podcast plenty of times, and it's a Mark Twain quote that says, if you find yourself standing on the side of the majority, it's time to pause and reflect. Now, Warren Buffett says things like, be fearful when other people are greedy and greedy people when other people are fearful. And I don't really like the terms greedy and fearful, but the sentiment of thinking independently and being prepared to go against the general consensus is a really, really good idea, as long as it's backed up by really good fundamentals. Because it's not a good idea if everyone says don't jump off a cliff. You don't just go jump off a cliff because everyone says don't do it, right? So it's not about just trying to like find the things that just do the opposite. It's not a good strategy either. But it does make sense if you can cut through the noise and make decisions that are slightly contrarian. You stand to make significantly more gains as long as you're doing that in a really smart and calculated way, which is really interesting. And I'm really interested to dig into Bundaberg because this is a great example of people who got in early in the market. And we want to dig into that a little bit. But I just actually want to tell a little story because Bundaberg is, I remember in I think it was early 2020. I would say like around the start of 2020, early 2020, maybe January 2020. We had a client and I was keen on Bundaberg. I was like, right, I can see what's going on in Bundaberg, right? Early 2020. I could see it coming. I was very excited about it. We found a unit block, 6 units. I still remember it clearly because I did so much due diligence on it. 6 units, 8.4% yield on about $1 million unit block. I think it was for about $800 something thousand unit block. Man, that would have been awesome. Like, imagine if you could find that today, Sean. Like, imagine if you
And then the other thing too, over that time, like rents have grown so much in Bundaberg, like all good and well that it's an 8 something now, but they might be at 12, 13. Like you don't even know what yield that would be today while still getting the ridiculous growth as well. So, have your cake and eat it too.
Totally. But that investor didn't buy it. That investor didn't. That investor did not. I know that hurts so bad. That hurts so bad. Yeah. That investor didn't buy it because he just couldn't quite get over looking at the historical data. Like he was like, and it was really interesting. He's like, oh, it looks like it's a stagnant market. Nothing's going on there. He just wasn't able to look forward. He was only able to look backwards, and as a result, he chose not to buy that unit block. In fact, he chose not to buy anything. Right?
That's a really interesting point with the historical data, because I think, having reviewed hundreds and hundreds of suburbs, quite often the ones that can perform the best, if you were to look historically, might not look that fabulous at all. But then, history isn't always a clear indicator of the future. And Exhibit A, case in point.
100%. And so now, a little bit after with that, we got very, very bullish on Bundaberg. That was still pretty early. When I was talking to that guy about that unit block. But I could see the green shoots. It was pretty promising. But then we got very, very bullish after that. Do you want to kind of talk to like some of the historical data? Because it's pretty interesting. When did we really start sinking our teeth in and going full bore in Bundaberg? Do you remember when that was? Was that like October 20 or something like that?
I think it was, around October 20. I don't know the exact date, but sort of on the historical point, the really interesting thing that I found in one particular suburb that we did buy a lot of property in was that the median sales price was $291,000 when we opened the suburb, and in May 2007 it was actually $300,000. So you could say completely stagnant for about 14 years, if not a tiny little bit backwards. Yet obviously the performance over the following 18 months absolutely astronomical. So
do you want to talk to that? Okay, so 2007 the median sales price was about $300,000. 2020, did you say?
Yeah, 2020, about late 2020.
Late 2020, the median sales price was $290,000. So stagnant, slightly pulled back, nothing to see
exciting
here. Nothing exciting there. Do you know what the median sales price is in that suburb now?
Oh, no, I don't actually, but I could very confidently say that it's had in excess of 30% growth, even just on the median. So far more growth than it had over the past couple of decades, I'd say.
Yeah, which is pretty interesting, right? And because a lot of people think property markets just, they look at historical growth and go, oh, what's the average historical growth over the last 10 years? People often use a 10-year average. They go, what's the growth over the last 10 years? Is that an indication of what's going to happen in the next 10 years? And then they try and superimpose that. But typically what happens in the last 10 years is not what's going to happen in the next 10 years. And if you can get the timing right, a lot of people say you can't time the market, right?
No, we've got some pretty good examples to say otherwise, actually.
If anyone out there thinks that you can't time the market, then I absolutely encourage you just to go buy any property, anywhere, anytime. Because if you truly believe that it is impossible to find the right time to enter into a market, then it literally doesn't matter what you buy, when you buy, where you buy it. Just go buy stuff and hope for the best. You know what I mean? So let's talk about that moment in time when we really sort of started getting into Bundaberg. What were some of the things that you can see in the data that were changing that might have been an indicator that it was a good time to get in?
Yeah, look, there's obviously like a plethora of data that we go through, but some of the really strong ones were a direct and sharp increase in sales activity or buyer demand in the area. Also, a really steep and quick increase in vacancy rates was another key one, where we started to see a little spike in rents, which is always a good sign, among a huge amount of other things too. There's obviously a good lifestyle piece, great affordability piece. There was about $9.5 billion worth of projects within a 100-kilometre radius. There's just a lot of ticks in the right direction. Whereas obviously if you had your binoculars on just on the MSP, on the median sales price, it obviously wouldn't be looking too promising. But all these other boxes pointing in the right direction, really showed quite promising signs.
I totally agree. But do you think, why did we stop buying there? Because it's very interesting, right? Because there's a lot of, very well-known property professionals who are publicly stating that it is a great time to buy in Bundaberg right now. Right now. They're saying, it's great. Why do you think that it is not a good idea for people to buy there right now? Let's talk to that, because a lot of people are saying it's good. They can see the prices going up. They're like, look, the prices are going up. Isn't that going to continue?
Yeah, there's a few things that go into it, but I think probably the most interesting one to think about is that ideally, like, why would you be jumping in now after 30-40% growth? Like, we're not saying that it's going to stop growing or go backwards, but the ideal scenario is still to get to buy effectively in a market where there's less competition, where you might purchase for, quite a reasonable price, potentially under market value prior to this craziness, and ride the whole wave rather than the little tail end of it. Another piece that's sort of critical for us too is that we want to buy effectively for our clients. We don't want to be paying over market value or getting into these crazy bidding wars, which tends to happen once these big headlines start. Quite often there is some early adopters and people that get in prior to those as well, and we can sort of start to see things heating up before that. But obviously once the masses move in, it is very, very challenging to purchase effectively. And that's the point where, if you were just in the habit of just buying anything anywhere and just hope for the best, like, all good and well, but ideally you really want to purchase for a good price, not just a fair price, and you don't want to be getting in these crazy kind of multi-offer scenarios where you're forced to pay traditionally what would be over market value in terms of a bank fail or anything like that.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, because that's a really interesting point, because a lot of people say that market value is whatever people are prepared to pay.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, and something we run into all the time, because this is something we have to go through quite a lot with the analysts, because realistically, if you're buying, a standard house in a suburb where everything sells for $450,000, and then some silly person, for lack of a better word, goes and pays $1 million for the same home down the road, is that whole suburb now worth $1 million? Like, the question is, that home is technically worth $1 million if you take market value as what somebody will pay for the property. But then there's an interesting comparison between what is market value deemed by the market and then what you would say is good value or fair value, or where we can see, that we're putting the client in the best position possible, which can often be two different things. And normally the gap between those two values skews the furthest in these markets where the competition is this high, because people are willing to pay more to get into the area they want to be in. They're facing a huge amount of competition. So that's what accelerates the market value for us, which is what we really want for our clients. That's why it's best if we can get in early, leave the area, and now we're getting all these people who are willing to pay that it's somewhat exorbitant market value, which then drive the growth for us as we sit back and kind of watch.
So how do you rationalize? Because effectively, if enough people, like let's say on aggregate that we think that 90% of properties in Bundaberg, just arbitrarily, being sold for $50,000 over fair market value, doesn't that actually just mean that fair market value is in general 50 grand more? Like, why wouldn't people just get in there? Like, why wouldn't people do that? Because it's a really interesting thought process around like the over-exuberance of the market, right? Because there's bank valuations, that's one thing. Can you actually get a loan based on the amount of the number that you put on the contract? But then there's an argument that people are pricing in the growth, but then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that, well, if enough people pay 50 grand more, that's going to add 50 grand to everything. It's not like there's one outlier purchase in the area. Let's talk about you. Let's use you as an example. Why would you or would you not, as an individual, why would you or would you not participate in that environment? Let's say that you knew that there was, let's say it had 40% growth, but then you thought there was potentially another 40% growth in the market. Why would you or wouldn't you participate in that kind of an environment?
A key thing to think about is a couple of things: is how feeble the exuberance is and the crazy market activity is the first thing, because obviously if it's, like you said, if it's one or two people paying this crazy number, it's not really substantiated. If it's 50, 60, 100, the whole market, then that's a different story. The other thing too is that craziness and headlines and all that is fleeting. It doesn't last forever. So at some point, the intrinsic drivers of the growth in the area, being a whole number of other things, will get back in the pilot seat over the big push in headlines and buyer activity. So I think sometimes that growth can be not fake, but it can be feeble. And in areas, especially say if you're working at a $2 million suburb in Sydney or something like that, that big bloating of the suburb can actually contract once that, big excitement leaves. So I'm not saying these areas necessarily go upwards and downwards and all over the shop, but yeah, my willingness to participate in it would be trying to justify that the value is still there intrinsically, not just through the headline. And then the other thing too, of how much of that wave of that headline can I still ride in the back end of it, or how far through it are we, sort of thing. They're the couple of things that I'd really consider.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because it's really good to compare it to things like shares, right? Because it's pretty easy to understand if anyone remembers the whole kind of GameStop thing going on, where it was like a lot of people got really excited and really hyped up, and they overinflated the prices of these companies just because they drove up the sentiment and
the headlines,
and the headlines and the activity, and that can kind of now. And again, I agree with you. I don't think Bundaberg is going to go. This is not in any way to say that I think Bundaberg is going to suddenly go down in value. Not at all. No. I think it's got a long way to go yet. But it does beg the question around how you define like what is fair market value. Is there a process that you go through when markets are starting to get ahead of themselves? Is there a process? Because like, how do you go about defining fair market value? I think it's a really interesting question, because obviously you look at comparables, but then if the market is trending upwards, AVMs typically can't keep up with that kind of stuff. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, that's the tricky thing, and that's the bane of the existence of lots of my team is that we buy in high growth areas, and traditional methods of valuing homes is looking backwards. So if you're in a high growth market and you're valuing backwards, you can quite often miss. But there's a few tools that we do use. Obviously, the data and tech team have done this brilliant job creating the ability to have a predictive model, which can quite often give us a good example of how far we think the suburb will grow, which does quite often feel like cheating, but it's an excellent tool to use. The other thing too is that if we're really confident, if we can see the whole armory of data and which direction that the market's going, and quite often in some of these suburbs, like I think for the last quarter we reviewed 19 and a bit thousand properties, you get really, really in tune at what is valued in different markets. Like in some values, certain home characteristics will have certain values, and we can get really, really in touch with whether it is a good buy or not necessarily through just traditional CMAs. So yeah, there's a whole different bunch of things that we can use, but I think the main one is if we're really confident in the suburb and the data, and really confident that the property is a good buy and is desirable, and we're riding that wave, then we normally got our finger on the buzzer pretty closely.
How many properties did you say that you guys had analysed in how long?
I do the initial shortlisting. So over the last quarter, I've looked at 19,600 and something.
19,600 and something in the last 3 months.
In the last 3 months, yep. And then of that, then a large amount then go into the shortlist for the analyst to then review, which takes a deeper level of due diligence. And then an even less amount then get presented to our acquisition managers, and then a smaller amount gets presented to the client. So of
19,000 in 3 months.
Yeah, it's a lot of properties. So it's funny. It's like my partner come home and I might not remember a birthday, but I can remember the colour of the kitchen in a property I shortlisted like a week and a half ago. So it's just about all I look at, to be honest.
That's crazy.
Yeah, so
that's crazy.
Yeah, of that 19,000, there's only really like, it's interesting to look at the funnel and the percentages that go down. That's only say 1% ish of the suburbs in Australia, and then potentially 1 to 2% of those properties might even make it to the next team to review for our clients. Yeah. So it's a very, very steep funnel from that 19,000.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Okay, cool. So let's talk about let's get a little bit granular, because I think that one of the biggest problems when people hear about a hotspot is they can still go and stuff it up, right? I actually think that it is one of the kind of malpractice of most of these people to be able to go, hey, the latest hotspot is Bundaberg, because Bundaberg's it's a regional centre. It's still a pretty decent sized place. And you can
plenty of places you can go wrong.
Plenty of places you can go wrong. You could buy the wrong property in the wrong street, in a flood zone, in the wrong suburb. You could get all kinds of things wrong and kind of like not make it work. So there's a couple of little interesting things in here. So number one is like not looking backwards and looking forward. And I'd love to know if we've got any kind of like, if you've got any examples of people who capitalized on that. And then I'd also like to dig into like, what happens if you get the wrong place? You get the like right area. So we'll say Bundaberg. Like, oh, Bundaberg's a hotspot. Let's just go buy any house in Bundaberg. Let's start there. Like, have you got any examples of like where people can go wrong? Because I think it's a huge thing that people go, oh, Geelong's a great place to buy. So well, Geelong's got a lot of places in it as well. You could very easily go wrong. Have you got any examples of where people have sort of gone wrong there?
Yeah, no, I think you're 100% right. Some people just pick a news source, and then whatever that news source says, obviously that's where we buy. Realestate.com, sort by the newest listing and let's buy the top one. But that's not necessarily always the best way to go. So I do have a couple of ripper examples. So one property we bought in Bundaberg was really interesting. The previous owner paid $260,000 for it in 2007. We then bought it for 270,000 in October of 2021. So that previous owner's got 10 grand of growth in 14 years. So that's 3.8% ish over the total of 14 years. And we've just had a bank val done at 413 grand. So we've got 143 grand of growth in 17 months. So that's about 52% growth.
52% growth.
Yeah, and while having a 6.7% yield.
Hey, we bought it for we bought it for 270 and it's now worth 413.
Yeah.
Wow, that is,
and still got plenty of room to go to grow in Bundaberg. We're not sort of saying that it's completely done and out. Like, this is just sort of the start, but it definitely highlights how good it can be if you do ride that initial wave.
That's crazy. That's mental. What was the yield on that?
So it's 6.7 at purchase, but I did have a look. That suburb has had 25% rental growth between now and then. So, even if you just got the median, whatever the median rent was, who knows what that'd be now? Maybe a 9 and a bit.
Mate, that's awesome.
Might have to check my maths.
Okay, so just to recap on that. So the previous 14 years, they got 10 grand and like 3-point-something% growth. And in the next 14 months, there was 52% growth on that property.
Yeah, that's it. So
that's
unreal. You've got another corker, even like that's obviously a fairly cheap, affordable asset. But I even got one here with quite a large unit block, which is, it's nearly the perfect headline here. We bought it. The previous owner had got 44% growth in 14 years.
44% growth in 14 years, is that right?
Yep, in 14 years. And then we've got 44% growth in 14 months. So same amount of growth in months, not years. So, and this was at a 7.3% yielding unit block.
Wow. Wowee. How many units in that unit block?
I think it's 4.
Nice.
Well, I just have to double check the exact address, but from memory.
Nice. You remember the kitchens in like all of the...
Yeah, the kitchen.
So, so not the...
done 20,000 properties since then. I can't remember all of them.
Awesome.
But then another ripper thing that I found is in the same LGA, not the same suburb, but in the same LGA, I've actually found a home that was bought and sold very, very similar. So October and then was sold again very, very recently, October 21 to recently. It was bought and sold for the exact same number. So same time frame, same LGA, different suburb, and 0 growth over that same time period. So yeah, definitely not.
Why do you think that is?
I think it could be a number of reasons. I don't know the exact circumstances. It could potentially be somebody severely overpaid for something. I really don't know. I didn't look too much into the exact property. It could be a really bad campaign. Now it's very interesting that they didn't sell for more with all the market activity that we currently have. But you could think there could be one of those strikes against it, which is turning investors off. Like you said, it might have been they might not have been aware it was really heavily in a flood zone, or like something that a lot of investors will check that might have been a strong strike against, which now they're not taking advantage of that hyped investor interest. So
yeah, I think it's such a good point, and like we've said this loads of times before, that the difference between a good property or a good street and a bad street, or a good pocket and a bad pocket, can be as little as 50 meters, and it can be such massive. A significant shift in growth and long-term value. It's tremendous. Like that's phenomenal. Even in a rising market, someone's bought it and sold it for the same price, which means they've lost money, which means they've lost plenty of money on it. Man, that's crazy. What would you say to somebody who is looking at buying in a suburb, but they're like concerned about that kind of historical, looks like the prices haven't gone anywhere, feeling a little bit nervous, looks like a bit of a flat market? What would you say to someone like that to give them confidence? If it was your mum, right? Let's say it was your mum who was like thinking about buying a house in, let's say, Bundaberg back in 2020, and she was looking at it and she's like, but it doesn't look like the prices are going anywhere. What would you say to her? How would you explain that to her, that opportunity?
Yeah, it's very tricky. I think a couple of examples like that one are key, but I think the big one is that you really have to trust, the data and what you're looking at for the future, not necessarily just the history. Because as we saw there, like the history really has very little effect on what the future promising sort of factors are for a suburb. It's
a really tricky one, because like how do you give people confidence? How do you give people confidence to look forward, right? And I think that some of the things that you kind of need to look at is like buyer activity, supply versus demand, investment increasing in the area, and all of that kind of stuff. But it's a pretty hard hurdle for a lot of people to get over. So, I think the more that we can educate people to look forward, not backward, the better. Because I think that's still such a big issue. And what advice would you give to someone who is thinking? So, let's say they've heard about a hotspot. Bundaberg, perhaps, could be another hotspot. They've read an article in the newspaper and they're thinking about just going and having a crack at trying to buy the right property in that. What advice would you give someone like that?
I think a good one would be to just have a look at how much growth, there's headlines there now, but maybe just have a look at where it has traveled and how far it has traveled and, whether this is just the start of the wave or you're coming in the back end of it. Because some of these suburbs like this, you could read that headline, jump into some stats on Bundaberg and see that, a suburb might have gone up 45%. And if it's gone up 45% already, there's like we said, there's no saying how far Bundy will go. But again, is it ideal? Is it the ideal situation to be getting in? Would you have rather get the 45% plus whatever it's got left sort of thing? So that's a really, really key thing to think about, is that quite often by the time those headlines are in, you're really, really at the back end of a lot of the really good growth.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I actually made that mistake, by the way. So early on in our property journey, Gabby and I, like the second property we ever bought, and we didn't really have, we were still working out how it worked. It was like we'd bought one property, that was a dud, and then we were going to buy our second property. We read all these headlines, right? And it was like Nor Lane was like the hotspot, right? Nor Lane in Geelong. It was the hotspot. And we were like, oh, Nor Lane, yeah, let's go buy there. No worries. And little did we know, we looked at the graphs and we're like, look at the line, it's going up. We're like, this is perfect. Yes, it's going to keep going up. Literally, we bought at the peak. Like literally, we bought at the peak. We bought at the peak. Now, thankfully, we managed to buy a property that was significantly under market value. So we made money on the way in. So happy days. And thankfully, because of their consumer behavior and stuff like that, it turns out they had a second wind and it's had a massive growth spurt again since. But I think we were lucky there more than anything else because, at the end of the day, we followed all of that too. We didn't really understand the idea of getting in at the start. But it can be really daunting to get in at the start. It can be really scary. It can feel like, this doesn't feel good. And I don't know about the people here. And look, the unemployment is like this. But things change. Suburbs change. Suburbs gentrify. Suburbs grow. That is how property markets move. Even if we look at places like Bunbury, like not long ago, Bunbury was basically like, why would anyone buy in Bunbury? I remember when I very first started talking about Bunbury, people were like, oh, you don't want to buy there. It's a bloody cracked there. It's like people who just had nothing but bad things to say about it. And now it's one of the fastest moving markets in the entire country, right? And so I think the big lesson here is that people need to look beyond the stigma and they need to be able to look forward at what is happening in the market, look to see what the potential is and look to understand the underlying economics of it. It's like looking at a business that's doing a turnaround. It might look bad, but actually maybe there's great prospects for that business to turn around. But then not only that, you've really got to be mindful that you're not coming into these markets too late as well. The big lesson here is like, if you read about it as a hotspot, it's already too late. It's already time for you to turn your gaze elsewhere and keep looking, which is hard because most investors want validation. Most investors feel anxious and nervous and scared. They're just like, well, but at least I've got something that says this is a hotspot. Therefore, I at least can feel more satisfied, more confident and everything like that this is going to be a good decision for me. But in actual fact, that's a red flag and it's time for you to start thinking elsewhere and to get ahead of the curve. And to be a successful investor, you have to be able to think a little bit contrarian. You have to be able to get outside your comfort zone and you've got to stop following the news. That I think is what I'd be kind of taking away from this. What do you think, Sean?
Yeah, no, I think that once you see the MSP growth or the median sales price growth, you are pretty well too late. So if you're waiting for validation, then you've definitely missed the bus. But I think it's especially important now as we come out of this. Obviously, COVID was a crazy time across real estate, but lots of people were just throwing dartboards at the map over COVID and everywhere. There was like a macroeconomic influence on the property market where everywhere got a nice little, not everywhere, but everywhere got some kind of macroeconomic effect and push. Whereas now as we come out of that, we're even seeing, we buy all over Australia and I'm seeing every LGA start to act differently, whereas they all acted fairly similarly in that craziness during COVID. So obviously now that we come out of that stage, the intrinsic drivers for the LGA, like you said, jump back in the pilot seat in driving the growth, and that big macroeconomic push starts to recede, it's really, really critical that you do understand this, because it's no longer, the party time where you can just, like you said, spin the globe around and put your finger on it and then buy any property here and get great growth. It's really, really important that you consider the intrinsic drivers for why is that suburb, why is that LGA, why is that specific property going to perform well. Yeah, that's critical, I think, as we move forward.
Couldn't agree with you more. Like when the whole kind of COVID scenario was kicking off, I was quite vocal about the fact that, yes, some areas were like people were piling into these some small regional towns and stuff, good lifestyle drivers, right? And so people were like, yep, we'll move there for lifestyle, but didn't have any. You've got to have the combination of lifestyle, jobs, and affordability, basically, right? You've got to have a reason for people to stay there, not just go there, right? And we saw a lot. I could see loads of like coastal towns and kind of like regional centers and stuff but didn't have anything going on that you could just see we're going to get a sugar hit and come back off. But the problem was everything was going up. It was the everything boom, right? Everyone was like, you just buy a property anywhere and it goes up. And some of the magic got lost because people didn't pay attention to the underlying fundamentals. A lot of those markets are coming off now. A lot of those markets are coming off. Not the ones that had the underlying drivers. And so being able to sort the wheat from the chaff then was the key to setting yourself up for success now. And the benefit is now we get to like a lot of those kind of ones that were effectively stagnant markets that got a shot in the arm, an adrenaline hit that made them stand up and pay attention. They can, we're starting to fall away again, and we're starting to see the market start to return to some kind of normalization in terms of being able to identify those markets. So personally, I think it's a great time. Do you think it's a good time to be an investor? Would you be buying in today's market? A lot of people are worried about interest rates. And so what do you think about that?
No, I'm still looking to buy, and I think it's an excellent time if you can assess those things that we've sort of spoke about. And exactly like you said then, I think that's another good point with assessing how feeble those kind of sugar hits are, is that obviously some of these places, like you saw, if you're just picking wherever it is and they did just get that sugar hit and it is really, really kind of feeble boost in the market, it might not be a good time to be an investor. But if you can really assess these and get through them and find a place to purchase where it has the underlying economics behind it, then I think it's an excellent time to be an investor. And in terms of interest rates are obviously something that we battle all the time, but they move up, down, left, right, that they're constantly changing in real estate. And the good thing is, if you're purchasing in these kind of areas which have got great drivers to boost rental growth, you're locking in your price today for tomorrow's yields. Yields continuously grow because you only pay the purchase price once. You don't have to keep paying as the property keeps growing. So, fair enough if you do happen to cop whatever it is, $20 a week negative or $100 a week negative or whatever it does end up. There's heaps of ways to get around that, ways you could speak to your property manager to boost rents. Rents might be going up in the area already. Like, can we put paint in the place and get this thing positive? Like, there's heaps of ways around it. And I think people can get stuck on creating a non-solution for a non-problem when they're getting really, really upset about interest rates, when you really need to zoom out, look at the bigger picture, sort of like what you were saying with lots of Warren Buffett's ideas. If you're in the market of flipping houses, obviously different story, but you need to be thinking about the long term. And if you're assessing all those the strong economic drives to the area, whether you're negative for 6 months shouldn't be on your radar, really. That's probably the least of your concerns.
Totally. It's really funny, isn't it? Because people can lose their head over short-term type stuff. I was talking to an investor the other day, and they have 2 properties that they bought. Both had granny flats. Both granny flats were not council approved. So they had been renting them out. And getting stupidly good yields and, all good. They tried to get them approved. They couldn't. They've decided not to rent them out. All good. So they're doing the right thing. They're not doing anything wrong. They all good. But they said, look, we're not going to rent these out anymore. They asked me for some advice. They said, well, what should we do? We're going to lose all this rent. Oh, we're going to lose all this rent. The yields are going to drop. Should we just sell them? Should we just sell the properties? And I said, well, what's the yield on them now? Like without the granny flats. One was 7% and the other one was 6.8%.
Yeah. I said, when the national average is like 3.8, I think, or 3.9, something at the moment. So still double.
I was like, that is still a good property. Go and try and find that kind of property now. You're going to struggle to find, you would struggle to find in those suburbs a property yielding at those percentages. You couldn't go and buy a replacement property yield, getting that kind of yield in those locations. It's like, short-term thinking is like one of the biggest traps that most investors can get into, including picking spots because they're the flavor of the month, and including
100%.
making short-term decisions based on, short-term interest rate fluctuations and stuff like that.
No, I always think zoom out is definitely key. And it's funny, that yield piece, like one of the people that initially sort of taught me stuff about developments and all the rest of it, we were going through one of the properties that he owns recently, and he said when he bought it, he was forking out 20 or 25 grand a year in how negative it was, because he built this huge apartment complex, and it looked incredibly scary from what I saw. And then I was like adding up what it was going for now, and now it's like a 38% yield or something, but he's owned it for 10, 15 years. So it's just the key thing there, where he wasn't thinking about what's the yield tomorrow on this. He was thinking 20, 25 years, obviously completely different story. So yeah, I always think you got to zoom out and play the long game.
100%. Sean, great to chat to you. Thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciate your time. Looking forward to having you back again.
Thanks, mate.